welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. Today we're going to learn about the 2004 movie called The Aviator. Now, in case it's been a little bit since you've seen it, it has been 20 years since that movie came out, we'll kick off with a quick synopsis. The Aviator was directed by Martin Scorsese, and it's a biographical drama that chronicles the life of eccentric aviation pioneer Howard Hughes during the 1920s through the 1940s. He's played by Leonardo DiCaprio in the movie. And in the movie, it starts off in 1927 with Howard Hughes as a young millionaire venturing into the movie business as he's producing a big budget film called Hell's Angels, the likes of which Hollywood has never seen up until that point, of course. But Howard's true passion lies in aviation. So he starts his own airplane company, simply called the Hughes Aircraft Company. And through that, Howard employs engineers to build bigger and faster planes, culminating in the famous Hercules, or the Spruce Goose flying boat. But his achievements are increasingly overshadowed by his descent into obsessive compulsive behavior and germophobia. To help us separate fact from fiction in the movie, we'll be joined by someone who I am super excited to talk to about this movie. James B. Steele is one of only two people in history to win 2 Pulitzer Prizes and 2 National Magazine Awards. The other person, of course, is James' longtime collaborator, Donald Barlett, who together they co-authored the stellar biography called Howard Hughes, His Life and Madness. And as the review from the New York Times says on the cover, of all the books written about Howard Hughes, this is easily the best. I couldn't agree more. But before we chat with James, let's set up our game. 2 truths and a lie. Now, if you're new to the show, here's how it works. I'm going to give you 3 things. 2 of them are true, and that just means one of them is an all-out lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number 1, Howard Hughes was a self-made millionaire. Number 2, Howard Hughes really did his own test flights. Number 3, Howard Hughes hated the nickname Spruce Goose. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, your challenge is to identify which one is the lie. And of course, we'll do a recap at the end of the episode to see how well you did. All right, now it's time to connect with James Steele about the historical accuracy of The Aviator. Let's start today with a quick overview of how well The Aviator captured the essence of Howard Hughes' life. If you were to give the movie a letter grade for its historical accuracy, what would it get?
I would give it really a B plus, perhaps, because I think The Aviator only took care of about half of Hughes's life. But the half it dealt with, I think, projected very well where he was going, who he was, what his good points were, what his weaknesses were. So I think it was very, very successful in capturing that, and also foreshadowing really what he was going to become. I mean, we see in the end of it those overtones of the mental illness that would eventually be so destructive in his life. You can see that advancing. You can see him being conscious of it in a way. So I think that was very accurate. The aviation sequences, similarly, very good, and the same with the movies. So I thought, as those kinds of movies go, it was really very, very, really excellent. There were a couple of things that conflated in it that didn't bother me. One was like when he was trying to buy the prop planes for TWA. He was talking about trying to raise the money. Actually, that was the jet planes about 15 years after that. But big deal. I mean, it's the same concept. He had trouble making a decision. And that was one of Howard's great weaknesses his whole life. He had trouble making a decision. He obsessed over details. And sometimes it worked out okay, but sometimes not.
You talk about how the movie doesn't tell his whole life, and we don't really see in the movie how he gets his fortune. All it shows in the beginning is just a quick scene with him as a child, and then it kind of fast forwards to Hollywood, 1927, and he's already rich. Now, there are some clues that the movie says through dialogue that suggests that he made his fortune through drill bits in Houston, Texas, but can you fill in some historical context around Howard Hughes' early years and how he got his fortune before the timeline of the movie?
It's really a great question, because Hughes's fortune he owed entirely to his father. His father was the one who invented the drill bit. founded the company called Hughes Tool Company. Prior to this drill bit, anytime you drill for oil, the drills would always shatter when they hit a very solid rock formation. He developed a kind of rotary drill bit that he then patented, and that became the foundation of the oil industry, both in the U.S. and internationally for like decades. And the Hughes Tool Company, which his father founded, was the golden goose that really funded everything Howard wanted to do, whether it was movies, aviation, entertainment, uh, buying politicians. I mean, whatever it was, the tool company was the basis of the fortune. And the interesting thing about it is Hughes was a meddler, and he tended to meddle in all his companies. Sometimes it was for good causes to achieve the kind of perfection he wanted. Other times he was just a meddler. He always left the tool company alone. It was kind of his father's monument to his father's creativity and genius and so forth. And he just left it alone. Plus, it year in and year out provided him the money for all his other whims.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess the impression I got from the movie was almost that he was the one that founded that. So, but it's interesting. So he grew up with riches, basically.
He grew up with riches. And the interesting thing about the tool company, his father died when he was 18. His mother died a year or two before that. So he's basically an orphan at a very young age. He had an uncle. He had grandparents. Actually, he had two uncles. And the assumption was the family would kind of work with Howard to oversee things to make sure he came along. Right away after his father's death, he insisted on buying out all his other relatives. There had never been any sign in Howard of this streak of independence that suddenly exhibited itself upon the death of his father. It was a very bitter thing. The rest of the family was very upset by this, not because they were losing money or anything like that, but they thought, hey, this is a young man. We need to be here and watch over him, make sure somebody doesn't take advantage of him. Howard, who had not shown any streak of independence like that before, said, no, this is my company. I'm going to buy you out. I'm going to run things my way from now on out. So right from the very beginning, Howard cuts off his family in a way, decides he's going to go it alone. And he took to heart something his father had told him just sort of innocently one day. He said, Howard, whatever you do, don't ever have a partner. You know, they're a pain. Go it alone, do it yourself. But I think the family never for 1 minute thought that he was going to invoke that with them. I mean, his uncles and grandparents and so forth. So right from the beginning, Howard sort of set the pace, the course that he would really follow his whole life. He was essentially a loner, and even from the very beginning.
I guess I didn't even think about it until you mentioned that, but we don't really see any of his other family or anything like that in the movie, or not even any siblings. I'm assuming you're talking about kind of extended family. I'm assuming he didn't have any siblings or anything like that.
No, he was an only child, but his uncle, his father's brother, was a pretty famous writer and screenwriter in Hollywood. And he was the fellow who introduced both Howard Sr. and Howard Jr. to Hollywood. And what a glamorous life that was out there. So the family had a lot of talent in it. Another uncle had been one of the founders of the Cleveland Orchestra. I mean, there's all kinds of interesting things in the family. That, of course, I'm not knocking the movie on this. There's only so much you can put in a movie. But that's what's interesting about the whole beginning of Howard's life, who these people were, how he basically kind of tossed them aside and said, I'm going alone. This is my company. Sayonara.
So speaking of the movie, if we go back in the beginning of the movie, it shows Howard Hughes as he's working on this massive film project of his own called Hell's Angels. And according to the movie, it consists of like 137 pilots, 87 airplanes. Hughes, there's a line in there where he says it's the largest private air force, has like 35 cameramen, 2,000 extras, 24 cameras, or maybe 26. There is another scene where he's trying to find 2 extra cameras from MGM for a big dogfight scene. How well does the Aviator show the scale of making of Hell's Angels?
I think the Aviator did a great job of conveying the magnitude of this project. I mean, Hollywood had never seen anything like Hell's Angels. Even before the picture was shown. I mean, just the whole production. Hughes had his men scour Europe for World War I planes. had them shipped over to the U.S. He hired aces from World War One. Howard was just totally caught up in aviation about what the opportunities it presented. And he thought this war was so different than any previous war because of the emergence of planes and what a role they had had in World War One. So he wanted to really glorify their work, to show what they'd done, to capture the drama of that particular thing. So he, like I say, scoured Europe, bought these planes, hired the pilots, and some of the aerial sequences in Hell's Angels are just absolutely astonishing. And they hold up to this day. I actually watched the movie again about a couple of years ago with some friends. And the dogfights, the fights between the German and the Allied planes are just astonishing. And there's an interesting thing about those fights that I should mention. Hughes was always a perfectionist. And when he was shooting these aerial scenes, he was in L.A. Well, L.A. is beautiful for its cloudless sky, its wonderful climate. And he said, to really do this right, we need to show this with clouds in the background. This is Western Europe. This isn't L.A. that we're shooting this for. And when no clouds appeared, at a certain point, he got so frustrated, he said, let's move the entire thing to Northern California, where there are more clouds. So they then shot most of those sequences, of those really dramatic ones that show up in the movie, somewhere in the Bay Area, because he finally got those white, puffy clouds that gave some contrast to these planes that were brought. So here you have it, this typical Hughes. He doesn't spare a cent to make a production, to churn this thing out. If he has to start it over again, no problem. We'll do that. Money is no object, again, because of this golden goose back in Houston that just keeps churning out the profits.
I think we even see a little bit of that in The Aviator, where he sees, Howard Hughes sees some of the footage of the planes in the sky and there's no clouds. So he's like, you can't see how fast they're going. And so he hires a Professor Fitz, Ian Holmes' character, to find me some clouds.
Yes. And I thought that was one of the wonderful, realistic, and very accurate things that they did in the movie. And it was a very powerful thing that in his life, and which made the thing much more realistic. So, but it's a key to his personality. He was very obsessive about detail. And some of the detail he kind of went over the edge with sometimes. As detailed people do. I mean, I've got a touch of that in myself, so I understand that. But the other side of that is you create this amazing product. And that's really what he did with Hell's Angels.
Speaking of the details, no money is no object. And then earlier when you talked about him having trouble making a decision, in the movie, not Hell's Angels, but in The Aviator, we see the premiere of Hell's Angels, and it seems to be a huge success. But despite this, Howard says that they have to reshoot the entire thing for sound, because that's a new thing in movies now. It adds another year and another $1.7 million to the project. Did he really reshoot Hell's Angels for sound after it was already done, like we see in The Aviator?
He really did. He reshot the scenes between the actors and the actresses, because here's what happened. When he began the movie, it was still the silent era. So nobody's talking on film. And the actress who played the female lead was a beautiful woman, a Norwegian actress. Well, by the time that it was done, sound had made its appearance in movies. And he realized he's got to convert this thing to sound. Well, but he can't do it with this Norwegian actress who has this really thick, tremendous accent that, American audiences would be laughing in their seats over this woman talking to American flyers. So he looks around and he finds this young, very attractive woman by the name of Jean Harlow. And they bring her into the production as the female bombshell, basically, who's friends with the pilots. And that's the launch of her career. So all of those scenes are reshot from the very beginning. But it turned out, again, to be, from a production standpoint, from an artistic standpoint, a great step. That's what created the Hell's Angels we know today. As a silent film, even though the aerial sequences are amazing, would really not work. So, yes, he did this, and of course, it was a tremendous cost. By the way, I have never seen a figure for what Hell's Angels costs. I mean, I've seen numbers batted around here and there. It was obviously astronomical. clearly never earned its money back. But that wasn't important to Hughes. What was important to Hughes was this product itself, getting it right, dramatizing this great bit of European and world history, American history, these fighter pilots and what they did to help win the war. That's what was important. Glorifying aviation, glorifying what they did. So as long as he could afford it, he spent the money. And that kind of was his philosophy, basically, his whole life.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where, as I was watching The Aviator, I mean, you mentioned it mentions another 1.7 million, or it mentions this money, which these days we think of a couple $1 million for a movie is not that big of a deal, or a year to make it, or those sort of things. We don't really think about it, but to put it in the historical context of that time, that's just movies didn't cost that much. They didn't take that long.
They didn't cost that much, and I probably should have run out an inflation calculator on the 1.75 million and see what that is today. But obviously, it's still significant money. But the fact is, he had no problems about spending that money. What he wanted, as long as Houston delivered, he would spend. And the result was a product that helped put him into the history books, both with movies, aviation, and as one of these great unique characters in American life.
Something that we see in the movie while Howard Hughes is working on Hell's Angels are scenes of him working with his mechanic, Glenn Odenkirk. He's working on the planes that they're using for the film. But there's also a scene where we see the guy running Howard's business, Noah Dietrich, telling him that Hughes Tools is incorporated in Texas, so they have to see the bills. And then they're starting to question the mounting costs of the movie. So Howard's response in the movie is to have Noah start up a new division in the company in California, call it Hughes Aircraft. And then after the movie, the Hell's Angels movie is over, we see Odenkirk, or Odie as they call him in the movie, continuing to work with Noah and Howard as they're now making airplanes. We do still see Howard Hughes making other films, but from these plot points in the movie I just mentioned, I kind of walked away from The Aviator thinking that the movie Hell's Angels was a big reason behind Howard Hughes' interest in fixing and tinkering with airplanes. So it would be a natural transition into, well, he's already started this company called Hughes Aircraft for Hell's Angels. And so once the film's over, start working on airplanes. Did The Aviator do a good job depicting Howard Hughes' transitions from making films to making airplanes?
I think sometimes you have to have these transitions in a movie in particular. I think Howard was always interested in aviation, though. I mean, his father, he took his first flight when his father was alive, basically, when he was, I think, 16 or 17. It's something up in New England at one point, and I think the bug bit him then. So he'd always been interested, and he was a pilot himself. In the making of Hell's Angels, one of the little-known episodes in it, well, there were 3 pilots were killed in the filming of those incredibly dramatic aerial sequences. Hughes himself was almost killed, which is one of the little-known facts of that movie. He got so interested in the process about how to design these aerial things, he went up in one plane himself. And I think he banked too much in one direction, whatever it was. He crash-landed. It was reported at the time that he walked away. That was not true. They pulled him unconscious from the wreck, took him to a hospital, and he had to have facial surgery. In fact, Noah Dietrich later said he always had kind of a dent in one side of his face as a result of that crash. So he'd always been interested in aviation. I think what's so interesting about Hell's Angels and the aviation is, and this is a key also to Howard's personality, these were probably the two most dramatic emerging fields in the world and in America at the time. Movies and aviation, both glamorous, both dramatic, both with tremendous futures ahead of them, that you're moving from silent to sound in the movies. Almost yearly, the technology of planes was developing and evolving. And Howard himself was very, very much interested in that, which is why he hired a lot of really very talented engineers and designers for Hughes Aircraft, which originally was an aircraft manufacturing company. Then it evolved over time into a defense contractor, satellites, things of that sort. It had nothing to do with building planes. But again, this was his interest. He loved these two fields and probably loved aviation the most because this had the most science involved with it. his famous round-the-world flight in 1938 was a marvel of scientific achievement. Uh, he flew around the world record time, but the plane he flew in had all the latest equipment in it, uh, all the various gauges, everything you could think of for that kind of a flight. So he was very scientifically minded in that sense. He wanted to make a splash, but he also wanted to do it in such a way that would advance aviation and science.
I didn't think about it until you mentioned that movies and airplanes at the time were kind of the cutting edge. Like there was and it makes, I'm assuming then that Howard, maybe that was something that kind of drew him to those two elements, was just that this, nobody's really doing any of this at all. I mean, not at all, but to that scale at least.
To that scale. And the funny thing and the interesting thing about Howard, he was very, even when he was young, he was somewhat reclusive and shy. But it's interesting, he then sort of is fascinated and drawn to the two fields that are getting the most publicity. So it's like part of his personality is very secretive in a way and very much to himself, but he's drawn to that kind of attention. And his whole life he's doing things that call attention, even though he doesn't personally want to be the center of that attention. He wants what he does, what he achieves, what records he sets. He wants those to be the guiding force of his life. And so I think, one of the things that's so interesting about the aviation is he really was a pioneer back in the 30s with folks at Hughes Aircraft designing planes for speed, long distance, ultimately designed when he was with TWA. So it was a tremendous field that he saw great promise in, I think, before a lot of people did.
I want to ask about another scene, kind of in the movie, solidifying his focus on airplanes, but it also showcases his attitude toward money. It happens while he's talking with Jack Fry from TWA Airlines about a new kind of airplane that can fly above 20,000 feet. Higher up means less turbulence, so more people are likely to fly with a smooth flight. But then Jack points out that TWA just isn't doing well financially, so they can't afford that kind of plane. And then Howard just kind of thinks about it for a few seconds, and then he's like, okay, well, I'll buy TWA for $15 million, call up Noah and tell him to start buying. Was the real Howard Hughes just as cavalier with his money as the movie seems to suggest, this spur-of-the-moment decision to buy TWA?
Up to a point, that's a fairly accurate representation of the way he did function. I'm not so sure that example is exactly right, but the notion that that's the way he functioned is very accurate. He did have spur-of-the-moment ideas, and if there was enough cash around, he would ask somebody to start buying. And he did start buying TWA stock very slowly and eventually owned 75% of the airline. TWA's, I'm really glad you brought this up, though, because TWA, which sadly does not exist anymore, was one of the real great loves of Hughes's life. I mean, this is just really part of his being. He loved that airline. He loved everything about it. He was involved in the design of the planes, the character, the quality of the interior of the planes, the stewardesses. I mean, he was constantly inviting Hollywood personalities to ride free on the planes. TWA was this tremendous global messenger, originally just domestic. And he with Jack Fry were instrumental in designing one of TWA's iconic airplanes, the Constellation, with the 3 fins and its sleek body. Anyone who's watching or listening to this, I urge them to just go on the web and look up the Constellation if they're not familiar with what this plane looks like. I think it's the most beautiful plane ever built. I mean, it's just so sleek, so dramatic. It's a prop plane, but even so, it just kind of sums up his interest in what he saw for TWA. So the other thing that's so sad about TWA is, in addition to this kind of love of his life, which it really was, it also sadly, later in life, which you don't see in the movie, becomes part of his tragedy when he's not able, because of growing mental illness, to deal with some of the demands of converting the airline into a jet fleet as well. His procrastination instincts, his inability to make a decision, his attention to detail eats him up. All of these things erode him and ultimately lead to his second major breakdown, which is not seen in the movie, but part of the later story. So TWA was just pivotal to him, and you can't tell his story without thinking about that airline.
Was that unusual at that time for, him owning TWA to also be involved in the design of the aircraft and that sort of thing? I wouldn't imagine somebody owning an airline today is involved in the design of the aircraft.
Right. Hey, Rob, very good question and very good observation. That's what was unique about Hughes. He not only owned the airline, basically, every bit of it was at his kind of beck and call. I'll never forget in doing the research on the book, there was one little story I ran across of a guy who was working in the publicity office of TWA, which was then headquartered in Kansas City. And Hughes had one of his minions call the guy and said, "Get to L.A. right away." The guy gets to L.A. They send him to some restaurant to wait for details. Nothing ever happens. They call him a day later and say, "Okay, go back to Kansas City." Hughes changed his mind about something. But it was just this whim. Sometimes it was money. Sometimes it was the way he moved people around without, thinking about maybe their lives as well. But you're right. You just don't have somebody running an enterprise of that size, that intimately involved in the details. And down to, I think my memory is he even got involved in what the uniforms of the flight attendants looked like. But that was typical of Hughes. When he got into something, he was obsessed with every conceivable detail of the operation of that entity.
Did he see it as a reflection of himself, or was he just like his image out there? Or was it truly kind of like with Hell's Angels? Was it, this he wanted to, and Hell's Angels wanted to tell this story, but, with TWA, he wanted it to be the best or whatever that may, what was that kind of driver there? Do you know?
I think it's a little of each. I think in the case of Hell's Angels, he wanted the best. He knew how dramatic this story was. And he didn't think the public really understood at that time the incredible role that pilots and these planes had in the whole war story, because it was the first time planes had ever been used in a war. So yes, he wanted to do that. But at the same time, he was an obsessive compulsive, and he was enraptured with detail. And sometimes it had a good result in terms of a good product, but other times it didn't. He was later on beyond the movie when Hughes Aircraft had become a defense contractor. He had been dallying with a couple of contracts with the Air Force and so forth, and they were threatening to cancel some contracts. And the whole management of Hughes Aircraft couldn't get Hughes to focus on the issue. We've got to do something here, Howard. They're breathing down our neck. We don't want to lose these contracts. We got all of these talented people lined up to do this work. So what's Howard do? He commissions a study of what kinds of candy bars are being sold in the company's vending machines. Just totally obsessed with minutiae sometimes. So this is his story, both great things and yet really going down rabbit holes part of the time.
Well, we have talked a lot about Howard Hughes' work so far, and the movie does show some of his personal life as well, though. One of the major relationships that we see throughout the movie is with the actress Katharine Hepburn. Now, if we're to believe the movie, they truly seem to be in love, at least for a while. And then Katharine mentioned something about how they're too similar. She falls in love with Spencer Tracy and leaves Howard. Although even after they separate, it still seems like they care for each other. We see Howard buying some racy photos of Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn to keep them out of the press. And we see Katharine coming to visit Howard near the end of the movie. How well do you think the movie did showing the relationship between Howard Hughes and Katharine Hepburn?
I think it probably might have made a little bit more of that relationship than was there. It's still, the reason I say that, I don't know that any of us could definitively tell somebody exactly how deep that relationship is. But all the work we did suggested that they definitely were friends and that they were attracted to each other. The depth of that attraction was never been totally clear. And when the relationship did eventually fall apart, or they each went their separate ways, I remember we ran across one or two actresses who were really close friends of Kate, who said that she just kind of eventually became kind of bored with him, which is probably too strong a statement. But I think it suggests that it was never quite as deep, maybe, as the movie would have had it. But the fact of the matter is, I don't think we really know. I mean, she was one of the most private actresses who ever lived. And some stuff may have come out even since we wrote our book. But my gut feeling is it was not as deep as portrayed. The thing about Howard, he wanted to be seen when he was in his era, when he was very public. He wanted to be seen with famous people, especially famous actresses and actors. So all in his 20s, he's frequently found at the Hearst Castle at San Simeon for these famous Hollywood parties that the whole Hollywood crowd engaged in. And there's funny photos of him where he's dressed as in a German Alpine suit, hat, and so forth. I mean, all these kinds of things later we would never associate with him. So he was part of that whole crowd, and he loved the drama, the kind of the pizzazz that Hollywood was starting to engineer then, which it still, of course, has to this day, what movies have to this day. So he liked to be seen with a lot of these women, famous women, and there were a whole string of them over time. But I remember talking to one producer early in the research on our book and asked him about these general questions, Howard and the women. And he was somebody who lived through that whole period. And he felt most of this was overdone, that this was Howard's way of saying he's a ladies' man, but that really wasn't that important to him. But what was important to him was that the world thought he was a ladies' man. And that same thing is true of a lot of things with Howard. He wasn't a very good businessman part of the time, but it was important to him that the world thought he was a great businessman. So image was everything to Howard, more than what he actually lived out.
Do you think some of that was to help with his businesses, to like a movie like Hell's Angels, keep going back to that one. He made other movies, obviously, but like making movies, the popularity, being out and see in the media and all that helps.
Absolutely. I mean, it makes you a national figure. I mean, he became a national figure in a way his father never was, even though his father's company was bankrolling it. So, and he liked that. He liked being out there. He liked publicity about himself. He didn't necessarily want to hold a press conference or be in public, but he liked the fact that his name was there, his presence in effect. So I think that was a tremendous part of his personality. He liked that. He himself didn't want to actually be in the limelight personally, but he wanted his being to be there. His companies, what he did, he wanted publicity for all of them.
Okay. Speaking of the movies, if we go back to The Aviator, it doesn't really focus on much other than Hell's Angels, but there is a scene where we see some controversy about another one of Howard Hughes' movies called The Outlaw. As the movie puts it, it's a film about sex. The Motion Picture Association censorship board tries to stop it. There's even a scene, it was funny, where Howard Hughes has Professor Fitz, that was the Ian Holmes character, the meteorologist who's going to find clouds. Howard tells him to pretend to be a mathematician and measure the prominence of the mammaries, as the movie puts it, for Jane Russell, the leading lady in The Outlaw, compared to other films of the time. And while the movie doesn't show the same controversy around Howard's other films, it does talk about how The Outlaw was doing for Westerns what Scarface did for the gangster pictures by putting blood and guts on the screen. And of course, we talked about the sheer scale of Hell's Angels, which caused a lot of media buzz around that. So kind of collectively, as I was watching this and watching the Outlaw being questioned by the MPA's censorship board, I got the sense that Howard Hughes liked the controversy around his films. Did The Aviator do a good job showing those controversies?
I think it did. I mean, he loved the controversy, and he intentionally sort of threw gas on the fire any number of times. Nothing made him happier than for the Catholic Church to condemn one of his movies, because that immediately felt translated into box office receipts. So there's no doubt he really he really enjoyed being controversial and being kind of a bomb thrower on those kinds of issues. I mean, I think everybody agrees that Out was a very mediocre movie, but this certainly stirred up tremendous interest. And that was his modus in his later film career. Most of his later movies, I mean, none of them ever attained really, in my book anyway. I mean, I'm not a film critic, but at least the ones I've seen, none of them ever really attained what he did in Hell's Angels, which is really his first film, not the first one he financed, but the first film that he directed and was hands-on from beginning to end. All the later ones, The Outlaw. And there were a whole series of others. Some of the names I can't remember right now, but there was one I remember was called Jet Pilot with John Wayne and Janet Leigh, Tony Curtis's wife at the time, I believe. And he futzed around with this for years. Well, once again, it was aerial sequences with jets and other kinds of things. By the time the movie came out, like years later, it was terribly outdated. I mean, one film critic said it's sorry and silly, and anyway. But that's when his obsessiveness had gotten the best of him. So most of those later movies really weren't that good, and it was kind of a sad commentary on how I think in some ways his obsessiveness undermined his ability to do those kinds of things later in life. But he did like the controversy.
I guess that goes back to his liking to be in the public eye and having that his name in the press there. Yeah,
exactly, and it just got ingrained in the American public. Well, there's this rich man; he's doing all these things. Now look what he's up to. You never saw him for the most part. There were rare public appearances, but all of that built the image, built kind of the myth, the larger than life figure that he very much wanted to be.
Since The Aviator doesn't really focus on some of the other movies, it does show them, but we don't see Howard Hughes as involved in them as he is with Hell's Angels. Was he actually involved in those movies at the same time as, with TWA and all these other things that he's got so much on his plate?
He was involved in them, but there were other things on his plate. That's a good way to put it. So he wasn't, of his time, he couldn't devote as much to them as he could, which was one of the problems, because he insisted on making a lot of these decisions, even though he didn't have time to make the decisions, or he became obsessed with the details and couldn't reach a final decision. So, yeah, there were a lot of other things. I mean, the TWA battle that was not even touched on in the movie went on for really 20 years, one way or another, and was sapped a lot of his energy, needless to say. So none of those late movies ever attained what the early did, partly because he didn't have time to devote to them, and partly because he was distracted. And every time he hired somebody who was good, half the time these people would walk off the job because of interference by him. So that's one of the things that haunted him most of his life. He was constantly losing CEOs, managers, directors, because he was a meddler.
You mentioned the TWA. What was that the movie doesn't show?
After he gained control over it, he later on, and this is way after the movie, he had to make TWA had to make the transition to the jet age. And other airlines were ahead of it, had already ordered Boeing 707s. Boeing was really the first one to really build the jets. And he didn't want to just go up to Boeing as another customer. So he talked another company into building the jets, a company called Convair, which had built prop planes for years. And the cost of them and some of the design problems with them, the original fleet couldn't even fly coast to coast. Undermined TWA tremendously. And then the minority stockholders sued him, and the litigation went on for years and years and years. And in fact, one of the things that provided a lot of richness in our book was that lawsuit these TWA stockholders filed, because Hughes was forced to divulge all kinds of private things about his empire they never wanted out. So So he got himself into trouble, in other words, losing some of his own privacy and secrecy because of his own missteps.
Okay. Because we do in the movie we do see TWA versus Pan Am is kind of the the battle that we see between the two airlines there. So I guess it sounds like he had a lot of battles to fight with TWA.
He did. Exactly.
If we go back to the movie's storyline, in July of 1946, Howard takes a prototype spy plane called the XF-11 on test flight. The flight lasts for an hour to 45 minutes. Just as he's about to land, the starboard engine sputters and blows out smoke. The plane ends up crashing into a residential area. It slices through people's homes. We can't see any people killed on the ground, but it's a horrible crash. Nearly kills Howard Hughes. He manages to survive, but not without serious burns that land him in the hospital. Did that crash really happen with the XF-11 the way the movie shows?
That is one of the most realistic incidents in the movie, really of any crash I've ever seen. And I think it's an absolute depiction of what happened. When the plane landed, it sheared off the top of one house, crashed into another couple of houses. One of the great miracles was that nobody was in these houses. And the only person hurt in the crash was Hughes himself. He was almost killed. And that crash and that plane are really a key to Howard for various reasons. One is the injuries were so severe that he did become addicted to painkillers. And he was actually lucky to live. He had all kinds of broken bones, other kinds of problems. And it was a miracle that he actually survived that thing. The other part of it is, this was one of the war contracts that he had to like contribute to the war effort. And he'd failed to deliver this plane by the end of the war. I mean, he'd not been able to do that. So in a way, he had failed in the contract, even though it was a beautiful kind of plane. The crash itself, is really indicative. It almost sums up Howard perfectly. Here's this, it's a beautiful plane, the XF-11. It's got two engines with rotating props on each engine. The Air Force has commissioned it, and the Air Force lays down very strict rules about how long the test flight should be. They say it should be 45 minutes, and the plane should be loaded with 800 gallons of fuel. Well, what's Howard do? He loads it with twice that much fuel. So right away he's thinking, I'm not going to be up there for 45 minutes. I'm going to see how this goes, and I'll push it. I mean, the same thing had happened to him earlier in the 30s when he was test flying a racer. He went too long, ran out of gas, plane crash, didn't hurt him bad. But he's always pushing the envelope. He's always going a little further than he should in some cases. And if he had taken that flight up, the XF-11, and landed it as the Air Force had wanted, there would have been no crash. But the fact is, he went too long. And it's my understanding of my limited knowledge of aviation and planes that on these test flights, they don't want to push him real hard. They want the plane to come down. They want to see how everything is behaved. They want to see how the engines perform. Is there something that isn't right here? Is there too much of a stress here or there, somewhere else? That's why they limit the amount of time they're up there. But Howard went 30 minutes beyond. And as a result, at the end of that 30 minutes, the starboard engine conked out. One of the propellers began malfunctioning. The plane began a drag to that side and then began quickly losing altitude. And then crashed in Beverly Hills, of all places, rather than he couldn't even get back to his home field. So here you have Howard. It's a beautiful plane they've designed. It has all kinds of possibilities. He himself wants to be the test pilot because he's built this thing and kind of designed it, parts of it he's designed. He does the test flight. He goes too long because why? He has this history of recklessness, of pushing the envelope. Sometimes that envelope works. Sometimes it doesn't. But he's having so much fun up there flying, he doesn't want to quit. And it turns out to be a disaster, and he was lucky to live. The Air Force put the total blame for the flight on pilot error. And he went too long. And it was so, but again, that's why I say it sums up Howard. That's what made him so interesting and also so destructive even to himself in many cases.
You mentioned a crash earlier in the 30s. I think in the movie we do see a crash, and he's trying to do it like a speed record in 1935, and he ends up
Yes,
crashing into
yes,
a beet field. Was that the one
the
you were
beet
referring
field,
to?
right, right. Almost the same thing happened there. He he was having so much fun. The plane was behaving so well. He forgot to look at his gas gauge, and he ran out of gas. And fortunately, he was able to land in a soft landing. He was unhurt in that particular flight, but uh, over the years, he had a half a dozen plane crashes of varying sorts. The XF-11 was the most dramatic, but there were a number of others.
I think there's a line of dialogue in the movie where we see Odie mentioning like we have 20 test pilots on staff, and he's still up there flying the planes first. What would it be fair to say he was an adrenaline junkie? I mean,
I would say so. Well, I mean, the first thing is he loved to fly, and he loved to be the first one to fly one of these planes. Every one of the planes he built in for speed in the 30s could have had some other test pilot. Who was the pilot on his round the world flight? There were, I think, 6 or 7 other crew members, but he was the pilot. So Howard also knew that would bring attention to himself and burnish his image even more. So that all goes back to his love of being the center of attention in terms of the public mind, but not necessarily having to stand there.
yeah, yeah. And maybe with some of the crashes being in the public's attention for the wrong reasons.
Right. Exactly.
One of the key plot points from the movie that we haven't talked about yet is something it calls the Community Airline Bill, or CAB. And the bill ties together a lot of things that we have talked about, but I'm going to see if I can kind of summarize the way the movie sets this up. After Howard bought TWA, he wanted to build planes that could fly across the Atlantic in post-World War II era. So he rebrands Transcontinental and Western Airlines, which is what TWA stood for, to Trans World Airlines, be more global. And then in the process, it turns TWA into a big competitor with another major airline who wants to fly across the Atlantic. We talked about a little bit with that being Pan Am. In the movie, we see the president of Pan Am, Juan Trippe, being a constant thorn in Howard's side throughout a lot of the movie. But the competition really heats up when Senator Brewster from Maine wants to pass the CAB. And the basic concept of that bill is to make one airline handle all international travel for the United States. That airline just happens to be Pan Am. Basically, it would give Pan Am a monopoly, although Brewster, in the movie at least, he very clearly doesn't like using that term. Now, if we're to believe the movie's version of history, the CAB bill was even written by Pan Am. We even see Senator Brewster get the FBI start raiding Howard Hughes' home, trying to find things on him. The senator says he'll back off on the investigation if Howard agrees to sell TWA to Pan Am. Of course, Howard refuses. So near the end of the movie, we see snippets of like a multi-day Senate hearing from 1947 where Howard is called to answer questions like why he failed to deliver many of the airplanes, the XF-11 we talked about, which the movie says the Air Force paid $43 million for 100 of them, but they never received any. At the hearing, though, Howard brings up a lot of points about how Brewster is in league with Juan Trippe and Pan Am, the CAB bill, and there are a lot of other airlines who wouldn't be able to follow through with their orders either. In the end, Howard seems to turn the hearing around on Senator Brewster, and the CAB bill fails to pass. How well do you think the movie did setting up and explaining this community airline bill?
I think it did a pretty good job on this. I think the main thing which it really did was it showed you had these two powerful men who were competitors in this new emerging international air travel field. And Trippe, through Brewster, was using Howard's poor performance, frankly, in World War II by producing the aircraft he was commissioned to produce. They were going to use that as the lever to knock him down and then get all these other things for themselves. It backfired tremendously. And I think the hearing that we see in the movie I've actually watched the videotape of the actual hearing. I mean, that's one of the things that's available, one of the few things where you can see he was functioning as he was capable of doing. And he's absolutely brilliant in this thing. I mean, here's a guy who's shy, doesn't really like to be in the public. He's in front of these senators and he's excoriating them. He's talking about, I'm just a businessman out there trying to make a living, trying to build good aircraft, to produce good product and so forth. And you're in here haranguing me about this, that, and the other. I mean, he was totally at fault. Howard was. He had not delivered on these planes. He spent millions and millions of dollars in government money, a lot of his own money too. But the fact of the matter is he had not come through as the contracts had said he should. And yet, rather than being held up as a failure as a government contractor, as someone who would run off with the public's money, he turns this whole thing around and says, you guys are the flunkies. You're coming after me, this honest businessman who's trying to do all of these things, and for the favor of one trip of Pan American Airlines. He said, I'm just not going to stand for that. So it was an absolute brilliant performance, capable of the finest Hollywood actor. And it's adding to the amazing thing, people forget he was only slightly removed from his near fatal crash of like, I can't remember the number of months before that, but it wasn't very long before that. He'd almost been killed. So here he is showing up as a Galahad with his sword, going to fight these guys on the dais who are all flunkies because you're all lousy politicians who are trying to interfere in my life. It's an absolute bravura performance of the highest order. And I think the movie conveyed that antagonism between Tripp and Hughes very, very well. And also how well Howard had shot down the investigation. I mean, I thought that was very accurate in just about every way. There were a couple little details here and there that I'm not familiar with, but generally speaking, the import of it was very good.
It sounds like, as you were saying that, it made me think of, we're talking about the other movies and other things that he's done that by the time they came out, they were outdated. It almost sounds like maybe there's another thing of like, he's just used to taking however long it takes to get this done the way he wants it done. It doesn't really work with contracts.
Right. It does, especially government contracts with taxpayers' money. You're vulnerable in that area if you don't deliver, and you don't have a good excuse as to why you didn't deliver. And he didn't have to do that. I mean, they dragged out all kinds of things that could have besmirched his reputation, but his performance at the witness table just overrode it all. And that's what people saw on the news, on the newsreels at the time. So it's an absolutely astonishing performance given how vulnerable he really was.
Speaking of airplanes that take too long to build, another plot point that we see throughout the movie, it finishes at the very end. Another prototype plane, the Hercules. And according to the movie, the need for this plane comes because Americans are losing ships to German U-boats in the Atlantic. So the idea is to fly troops and supplies over the water instead. The Hercules is going to be the largest plane ever built. It's 5 stories tall, has wingspan longer than a football field, capable of transporting a dozen Sherman tanks, 700 soldiers across the Atlantic, according to the movie. But it takes too long to build. And when the World War II is over, the U.S. government cancels their Hercules order. But then in the movie, Howard decides to finish building it on his own dime. And in 1947, we see him, again, personally doing the first test flight. Well, I guess according to the movie, it was a taxi experiment, and Howard and his team were doing in November of 1947. He said he wasn't going to try to take it in the air until next spring. But then as he's going, in the movie, we see Howard having this flashback with the Senate hearing, and he's taxiing on the water. And so it seems like, okay, he makes the decision, he's going to try to make her fly. And she does. The plane flies. We don't really see for how long. I actually timed how long it was in the movie. It says there's 58 seconds from when it goes airborne until the movie cuts to the next scene. So it doesn't really show exactly how long it was, but how historically accurate was the movie's plotline around the Hercules?
I think this was very, very accurate. I mean, in the Senate hearing, and I can't remember if the movie got into this or not, but in the actual Senate hearing, the senators kept berating him about these planes that either didn't function or never flew or whatever. And that stuck in his craw. I mean, the minute he left the Senate hearing, he thought, I want to see if we can get the Hercules to fly. How can we finish it? Can we do what we need to do? All his energy went into that. So that was a goal he had almost in the very beginning of leaving the Senate hearing. I'll show these scummy politicians up there, who's boss, this plane will fly. So everything was directed in that direction. And I suspect, though it's never been nailed down for certain, that he always intended to try to take it up in the air. That it was billed as a taxiing experiment. But when he got out far enough in Long Beach Harbor, and there wasn't any obstacle ahead of him, he gave it some more gas and lifted off. I can't remember exactly. I think it flew for about a mile, maybe 2 miles, something like that. It wasn't long, and it was only a little bit off the water, but it did fly. And that was a big deal to Howard. And of all the things he built over the years, the Hercules, which had this pejorative name, the Spruce Goose, was one of his projects, maybe closer to his heart than anything. The building of this plane was an absolute engineering marvel. I mean, there's a shortage of metal. This entire plane is built out of wood. If you have a piece of metal that's, let's just say, part of the wing, you know exactly how much that metal weighs. And if you have another part just like it, it should weigh the same thing. That's not true of wood. Wood has a different density. So the engineering, the building challenge of putting together this thing of this size, it was the largest plane ever built. I think it was something surpassed it 2 or 3 years ago. Maybe it was a Russian plane. I'm not sure exactly, but largest plane ever built for eons. But just the engineering, the building of that was an incredible achievement. And so the fact it flew even for little, Howard viewed as a triumph. And also the fact it showed we're going to build bigger and bigger planes in America. So all of these things flew into it. One last thing about it. The Hercules was so close to his heart because of the energy he'd put into all of the decisions to build it. I mean, think of this thing. You described it perfectly. 5 stories tall, all made out of wood. Just finding the wood and getting that, all of that stuff is a tremendous challenge. After he flew it, it went back to Long Beach Harbor, where it sat anchored for really until his death. The highest compliment he could give you, if you were a visitor before he slipped out of sight, was to give you a tour of the Hercules. And anybody who was accorded that, it was like the highest honor to just see the inside of it, see the control panel, see the storage areas, all of those things. So Hercules was part of Howard's whole persona. I mean, it represented his courage, his defiance of things, the triumph of engineering and design. He cherished that plane to the end of his life, spent a fortune maintaining it all the way through those years. But nothing was really more important to him in the latter part of his life than what he had done with that plane.
You mentioned the nickname for it, the Spruce Goose. And in the movie, we see it's Senator Brewster who came up with that nickname. So I was kind of confused in the movie if Howard Hughes, he seems to hate the nickname. I should say that. But I wasn't sure if he hated the nickname just because of the nickname or if it was because Senator Brewster came up with it. Did he actually hate that nickname?
He hated the name. He hated the name because it seemed to minimize the creation. I mean, Hercules, Hercules, this is Hercules, strong, big, powerful. Spruce Goose, I mean, goose, I mean, I've got nothing against gooses, but geese, but, well, they're not exactly, you don't see the goose on the American emblem of birds that we want to salute in this country. So he hated the name. I'm not sure exactly who came up with it, but he hated it, despised it. And I don't even think he used the term flying boat. I think he used just Hercules.
There's one more major plot point that we see throughout the entire movie I want to ask you about. It's Howard Hughes' germophobia. We see it shown in the movie with the opening scene. Howard is a young boy, and his mother suggests that he's not safe from illness. And then throughout the whole movie, we see it kind of growing in little bits here and there. There's a scene with Errol Flynn who eats something off of his plate, so Howard just stops eating at all. Or when he seems to trust Katharine Hepburn enough to drink some milk out of a jar after her. And then after she leaves him, he burns all the clothing she's ever touched, even the clothes that he's wearing after she leaves. And then it's used with, speaking of Senator Brewster, he uses it against him, purposely puts a thumbprint on his glass when he tries to blackmail him into selling TWA. And then, of course, there's that sequence in The Aviator where Howard secludes himself into the theater for a long time, refuses to let anybody in. We even see it grow into what I'm guessing is OCD of some sort, where Howard starts to go into fits of repeating a phrase uncontrollably. There's some scenes where he covers his mouth with his hands to try to get himself to stop saying things. The very last scene in the movie, after the Hercules test flight, is Leonardo DiCaprio keeps repeating "the way of the future" over and over, and he can't seem to stop. Do you think the movie did a good job portraying Howard Hughes' germophobia and OCD throughout his life?
I think it did. And John Logan, who wrote the screenplay, said some nice things about our book in terms, in part, I think, about those parts of it. Because when we began our research, to tell you the truth, we were just a little bit skeptical of some of these stories we'd heard about the germs, like maybe they're exaggerated. Well, it turned out by the end of our research that they were not exaggerated. I mean, he really had this fear. And the foreshadowing in the beginning with this thing from his mother, that's a really major part of the early part of our book, because we found some letters that she'd written to a scoutmaster that of a camp Howard was at during the summertime. Just letter after letter, like, make sure my boy doesn't have a cough. If he has a cough, let me know. We'll get him out of camp. And I understand another boy's sick there. I mean, just tremendous germophobia out of the mother, really, really worried about everything like that. So from an early age, he sort of became aware of this concept. And he also had a weak constitution in a number of ways. He had some allergies and succumbed to some things. Anyway, but as time went on, this got worse. It was an obsessive compulsive disorder that just got worse and worse as he went through life. And what happened was, a lot of people have OCD issues, but when you're as rich as Howard, you can surround yourself with flunkies who will cater to every one of these whims. And that's what he did the last 15 to 20 years of his life. I mean, the fellow who ran Las Vegas for him, Robert Mayhew, never saw Hughes in person. They communicated by memo, phone call. I mean, he shut himself off from the world the last 15 to 20 years. It was a gradual thing throughout the 50s, where people he had once seen could no longer see. You have to communicate through one of the aides. So he only had half a dozen people around him who ever saw him day in and day out, because he could control them, make sure that they were sanitary. He had memos written, 5, 6, 7-page memos written about how to control what he called the backflow of germs. In other words, if somebody had a cold, you don't want them anywhere near you or anybody around you, your wife, your kids. What's the wall we put up to make sure that doesn't come back to me? Big thing with him. There's some of these things, you'd say they were comical if they weren't so sad. When the longtime head of Lockheed Aircraft died, who he'd known for decades, he said to one of his aides, "We need to send flowers to his funeral, but we don't want that florist sending a bill to us. Somebody needs to have an intermediary to pay him. Under no circumstances, any part of that flowers, any part of that get back to us. That's the way we'll present backflow," because he was obsessed with this longtime friend who died. He thought he had some kind of an infectious disease. He didn't. He died of cancer. But he was so obsessed with that whole concept. So I think it does a good job of foreshadowing. By the time, 15 or 20 years after where the movie ended, Howard's in a lot worse shape. He's really completely isolating himself. Only a handful of people see him. He's controlling everything around him, even though he lives in a dozen places over those next few years, one place or another. And anybody who said they saw him during those 15 years is basically lying. I mean, he sealed himself off completely, other than these handful of guys who answered to his every whim. And that's what becomes so sad about his story, I think, in the end. When he was young, dashing, handsome, most of his marbles other than his obsessiveness. He doesn't need anybody. He can buy what he needs. And somebody crosses him, he finds somebody else who does the work instead of that person. But when you're older and you're vulnerable, you need somebody. And he didn't have anybody because he'd cut off everybody. And the ones around him really didn't care that much about him. They're just working for him. They're getting a check. They're getting paid. And so when he needed somebody to stand up and say, Howard, we need to get you to a hospital. We need to get you somewhere to help with this, that, and the other. There was nobody because he cut himself off. That's part of his tragedy in the end.
I was going to ask about that. Since he has unlimited funds, basically, did he have medical personnel that were around him? I mean, even to help, as you're saying, the backflow of germs, I would imagine he's hiring a meteorologist in the movie to find the clouds. Like I would imagine maybe he would.
Oh yeah. And unfortunately, a lot of the medical staff around him were just doing what he wanted. They were writing the prescriptions for codeine and other pills that he wanted. The final result is this. Hughes was 6'3". He weighed 94 pounds when he died. And he had broken off in one of his arms needles that he'd clearly used to inject himself with codeine. He boiled this stuff down. He didn't take it he somehow made it liquid. He didn't take the pills. And we obtained an x-ray from the autopsy that showed this. So it isn't like hearsay. So you're 94 pounds, you're 6'3", what can I say? That's neglect of the highest order in one way or another. There's just no doubt about it.
Since the movie does end, it ends after the Hercules test flight in 1947, and we've kind of talked a little bit about it at the end of his life. Was there anything else that the movie missed out on after the timeline of the movie?
And that's a really good question. I mean, he was on this descent into complete seclusion, but he was still pretty active. The TWA battle for control of TWA consumed him for the next decade and a half. He made a few flunky movies. The 50s were really a washout for him. He was really in bad shape there with the drug use and the seclusion and all of these problems. He kind of got revitalized when he bought Las Vegas in the 60s. The opportunity to kind of be the lord of the desert occurred to him. Let's have a respectable American businessman who we all know about come here and buy these things that have been ridden with the mob and clean up Las Vegas and things of that sort.
He bought the city? You said he bought Las Vegas? Like he bought the...
He bought a number of casinos, bought a TV station there, developed close ties with all kinds of Nevada politicians, gave them money, and they viewed him as a plus based on what had been a very tawdry image of Vegas because of Chicago and I think Kansas City money and Cleveland money from the mob, if I'm not mistaken. So all this was a plus for the city. And Howard rode that, and suddenly he's revitalized. Now, he's not going out in public. He's shut up on the top floor of the Desert Inn casino where nobody can get to him. Nobody can see him. Nobody in Vegas ever sees him. They get memos from him. They get a phone call every once in a while, but they never see him. But this kind of energizes him. And this lasts for about, 5 or 6 years there. And then when the Vegas stuff starts falling apart, for the guy who ran it for him for a while, they hit an out, they parted ways, and other things happened. Howard himself was increasingly losing touch with things. So many parts of the empire were sort of taking advantage of things, running on their own. I'm sure some things were skimmed off here and there and so forth. And then in 72, 71, 72, he then starts his peripatetic stays around the world. He's in London, he's in Vancouver, he's in Managua, Nicaragua, he's in the Bahamas. Then he goes to Mexico. And every one of these places, they take the top floor of some resort hotel. And that's Hughes's new domain, every one of these places. But during this whole time, he's deteriorating very rapidly, even further. He sells Hughes Tool Company during this, when he's living in Nicaragua. And that, of course, brings a lot of money into the empire as well. But It's a sad life, really, from the 50s on in many ways, with the one exception of that Vegas period where he has. What becomes so interested later is how the rest of the empire functions without him. And that's what a lot of the book deals with. Because, he sends memos here and there about how to do this, that, and the other thing. But a lot of it's ignored. A lot of it's just disrespectful. The one thing, though, which is really interesting, he was obsessed by the nuclear testing in Nevada. And at the time, people kind of thought, well, it's kind of a nutty thing to be worried about. Well, I think you can argue Howard was really onto something there. I mean, in a way, it's kind of an expansion of the germ phobia. You have these things out there, but I certainly, in retrospect, can't argue with his concern on that, because we've never learned what to do with nuclear waste, radioactive waste in this country. To this day, we haven't. So it's unfortunately a sad story as it goes on in that regard. But there's an interesting part of this story I'd like to just tell you about, because it fascinated us from the very beginning. As he deteriorated mentally, and he really did, with these obsessive compulsive memos and how to deliver food to him, how not to open a door, I mean, all kinds of crazy stuff. When he had to, he could pretend like he was completely sane and rational. And there's the famous incident of the Clifford Irving biography, where Clifford Irving supposedly was writing Howard Hughes' autobiography, total fraud, said he'd met with Hughes, done all these kinds of things. Well, this flushed Hughes out in the open, in the sense that he had a press conference, 1972, where he had 4 or 5 people who had known him back when he was public. And they all asked him questions with this hookup. He was living in the Bahamas at the time. And they said, there are these stories, Howard, about you having these long fingernails and long hair and all of these things. Well, Hughes laughs on the air and said, well, how could I sign the documents I need to sign as running my business? That's very funny. He made light of the whole thing, when in fact, that is exactly what Hughes was like. But he could rise up for the moment, as sick as he was, and pretend to be normal. It was one of the oddities about his obsessive compulsive disorder. Most people who are that OCD, they can't do that. They're just kind of wacko. But he knew that would not be right with the public and not be right with this particular thing. So that's why, to me, he was a case study unto himself in terms of that mental illness, and why he, to the end of his life, became so interesting.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned your book there. I really appreciate you coming on to chat about The Aviator. So for anyone listening to this or watching this who wants to learn more about the true story, I would recommend picking up Howard Hughes, His Life in Madness, which you co-wrote with Donald Bartlett. I'll make sure to add a link to that in the show notes for this episode. But my last question for you is kind of a two-parter. The first part is for listeners who want to learn more about the true story we've been talking about today, and just ask if you have a favorite story from the book that's not in the movie, to give listeners a peek into that. And then the second part is that biography came out in 2004. So can you give us a peek into your more recent work?
Sure. On your first question, I'm really glad you asked that. They're obviously, in a book, there's a lot of things that the movie can't cover, and I'm not criticizing the movie, because I think the movie was very good. But one of the incidents, and it's not a big part of the book, but I've never forgotten this story, because I happen to have written this part of the book. The first transcontinental flight that Hughes did in 1936, where he set a new speed record, is to me one of the most dramatic little incidents in his big, amazing life. He's built this plane. He's engineered this plane in California. He's going to fly to Newark, New Jersey / New York. The plane's got the latest equipment on it. They've test run it. They've done all kinds of things. He was pretty good about that kind of stuff. And he was going to be the pilot. And it was just him. It was a solo flight. So they're all ready. January 1936, they're going to fly from LA to Newark. He takes off, and right away, somehow his antenna snaps off. So he doesn't have radio contact with the ground. In LA, anywhere else across the country, you're talking 3,000 miles.
You want contact.
Yeah, it's a long way, even in a nice fat plane nowadays. So he goes through a lot of cloud cover for a while, and it's rough. And then he hits a windstorm somewhere, which knocks the needle off his compass. So now he not only doesn't have radio contact, he doesn't know exactly where he's going. Fortunately, he gets out of the clouds, and he spreads a map on his knees of the route that he was going to take. And he's guessing at this point, this city will show up here, this city will show up here. He'll see the lights of these cities. And fortunately, it was a clear night. But here he is at the control of this plane, just himself, and a map on his knees, watching for lights of cities as he goes across the country. 9 hours later, 9+ hours later, he lands at Newark, and he set a new transcontinental record, single per pilot flying. It's not a big part of the book, but it's just the guy really was, in those early years, an incredibly heroic figure. He made nothing of this at the time to speak of. But when you delve back through the details, you saw exactly what had happened there. And I've in my own mind, I'm not a pilot, but I can just imagine sitting in this cockpit of this little plane, the engine whirring in front of you. Think of the energy it takes to hold something like that for 9 hours. And at the same time have a map spread out on your lap and still trying to figure out, well, is that Columbus, Ohio, or is that Cincinnati, Ohio?
I need GPS in my car.
We're so used to not having to do anything anymore. So there are a lot of incidents in the book like that, but I've never forgotten that one because it just kind of sums up the guy in so many ways. After Hughes, one of the things that we covered in the latter part of the book was a lot of the influence Hughes had in the political system, politicians. So Don and I always were very, very interested in this, subsequently wrote books about political influence on Capitol Hill. Back in 1991 and 92, wrote a book on the economic pressures on the middle class in America, fomented by policies in Washington largely, and what should be done about these. So we've done an awful lot of things about growing income inequality over the years. A range of things over the years, of everything, and one book about healthcare, the American healthcare system. So I've had a very fortunate career in that sense to look at a lot of these different issues. But I have to tell you that to this day, the single largest project we ever did was the Hughes biography. Just in terms of the length of it, the mammoth size of the research involved there. So it kind of stands alone in the kinds of stuff we've done over the years.
Fantastic. Yeah, we'll make sure to add a link to that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time.
Well, Dan, this has been great being with you, and really wonderful questions about a fantastic guy. Thanks so much.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. I'd like to thank James Steele once again for helping us separate fact from fiction in the movie The Aviator. As James mentioned at the end, his excellent biography called Howard Hughes, His Life and Madness is available right now using the link in the show notes. I've also got links to some of James's other work that I would encourage that you check out as well. Those are in the show notes for this episode, but if you're listening to this as you're driving or just unable to get there right now, you can always find them on the show's home on the web, basedonatruestorypodcast.com/314. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie again. Number 1, Howard Hughes was a self-made millionaire. Number 2, Howard Hughes really did his own test flights. Number 3, Howard Hughes hated the nickname Spruce Goose. Did you catch which one is a lie? Let's go in order, and we'll start with number 1. Howard Hughes was a self-made millionaire. Right away, we have the lie. As we learned, Howard Hughes' father was the one who started the Hughes Tool Company and invented a rotary drill bit that became an industry standard for the oil industry and led to Howard's fortune. So even though he had plenty of his own money-making ventures, he grew up with riches. So that makes this one the lie, since the term being a self-made millionaire implies he made all of his money on his own. And that means number 2 is true. Howard Hughes really did his own test flights. James told us that Howard was a bit of an adrenaline junkie who loved doing test flights of his planes, including the crashes that we see in the movie, as well as the huge Hercules test flight near the end of the movie. That brings us to number 3. Howard Hughes hated the nickname Spruce Goose. That is true. As James explained, the nickname Spruce Goose came about because the plane was made of wood to make it lighter. But Howard didn't like the nickname Spruce Goose because it implied that the plane just wasn't as powerful as Hercules sounds. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. If you heard ads on today's episode, you can get rid of those by subscribing to the producer's feed. That's available natively in the Apple Podcast app just by tapping on subscribe on the show's page. Or if you're using any other podcast app, you can access ad-free versions on the producer's feed over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/Patreon. Last but certainly not least, if you got some value out of today's episode, you can learn how to give value back to Based on a True Story. Help me keep it going over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/value or tapping on the value link in the show notes. That's all for today. Until next time, thanks so much for listening, and I'll chat with you again really soon.